You hate ads? I hate ads. You know what I like? Patreon.com/inkdependence keeps this blog ad-free. Hello folks, welcome to inkdependence.com. I'm Mike, and this is the Esterbrook JR. It comes in this very nice cloth packaging. This was sent out to me for review by Carrie at Kenro on behalf of Lena at Pen Boutique. So go check this out at penboutique.com. Thanks very much for arranging for me to be able to review this thing, because it's been a very interesting pen. All right, so inside this cloth box, you have a pocket square with the Esterbrook Forever logo, which is, if you're curious, two of these E's back to back. So you have the E, and they flip it, and you end up with this Forever symbol. Pretty nice, right? Okay. Inside, you have an ink cartridge. There's also a converter. Converter is in the pen. So let's put this away. And here is the pen. This is the Capri Blue Esterbrook JR. This is a modern pen, obviously, from the modern iteration of Esterbrook. And it comes in three versions. You have this Capri Blue, you have the Tuxedo Black, which I actually haven't seen in person or online, I don't think, and also Carmine Red, which you've seen from Penaddict and Well Appointed Desk and Fig Boot, I think, had one of those. In any case, that's the one that's been getting around. But I was like, let me see this blue one, though, because we have a blue J. So we'll talk about the difference and the similarities between the J and the JR here in a little while. So first of all, let's take a look at this pen. Then we'll compare it to some other pens. We'll talk about the similarities to the JR. We'll do a writing sample, and we'll get out of here. That's my plan. Okay, so this material has quite a lot of chatoyance, a nice depth to this turned acrylic, and it has gold-plated trim on here. In the cap band, you'll notice it has Esterbrook as a bit of branding. You've also got the Forever symbol up here on the finial as another bit of branding. And then, well, I don't know, let's talk about a couple of similarities. One is the clip, and the other is the size right off the bat. So the clips both have these double grooves. The clip on the JR here is far longer than the one on the Esterbrook J, which is a vintage pen, and also the cap bands don't have the same grooving, but they're still there. You get a lot of the same kind of design language from these things. Now, instead of the double jewels like you have on this particular Esterbrook J, you have double brass finials. Pretty sure they're brass anyway. Well, they're gold-plated anyway, but probably brass underneath that. And I think that's kind of a nice look. I don't have any problem with that. I actually, I like the jewels on Esterbrook's, but this isn't my favorite jewel. I like the transitional one that just has the lines. It looks like a toaster. I call it a toaster top. It's fun. Okay. Looking further at this pen on the outside, you have this ring that's sort of like a bit past midway on the barrel, and I was curious about this ring, and so I was talking to Carrie at Kenro about it. I said, what is that for? Is that just to break up the body? Because the regular J, the old one, has this lever for the lever filler that kind of breaks up the lines of the body and makes it a little bit more interesting. And he said, yeah. And I said, what would be really cool is if you could unscrew this, because then you could get to the converter. You could have like they do on some of the Leonardo's, where you can unscrew the finial and then you can get to the converter without having to open up the whole pen. You just take off the end. Or the Skyliner, the Wall Eversharp Skyliner, that newer pen, can do the same thing. And they said, oh yeah, that's the thing we thought about a bit. And then I was thinking, what if this was a blind cap and they put a piston in this? Like, I think there's room for doing interesting things with this JR body platform, and I kind of hope I see some of those come to fruition in the future. Now, none of that is for sure or anything. Just like my thoughts on what you can do with this design, because like if you've got this, you could just take this off and do things with it. So we'll see what happens in the future. Unscrewing the cap, you can see there is no there's no cap liner in there. In fact, you can actually see the back end of that disc. That finial disc inside the cap, but I haven't had any problems at all with this nib drying out. There's not a whole lot of room inside that cap for this nib to dry out. There's not a whole lot of air room, so I think it's doing pretty well. And I've had this for 3 or 4 weeks now, so I've got a fair amount of experience with it. These take a number 5 Yovo nib, which is right here, and this one is gold toned. The other ones, of course, are going to be silver toned to go with the matching hardware and trim. But this has the Forever symbol engraved on it. I actually think that's kind of a classy, very simple little logo, so I'm glad they have that. I think it's pretty neat. You've got the typical Yovo scroll work otherwise. You can replace this with any other Yovo number 5 nib unit. This unscrews. You can just take it out and replace it with something else. If you have one that's a custom grind or something like that from one of the other makers that uses Yovo, perfectly fine. There will be forthcoming a modern to vintage section, which is a converter, basically like they have for the Este, which will let you replace this section with a whole nother section, and then you can use the 80 gazillion nibs from Esterbrook that you might be able to find out there on the secondary market. These usually come fairly inexpensively, tend to, I don't know, more expensive ones are, are up there, but you can get these for pretty low prices. And there are a lot of different forms of these things. There's whole charts full of what these are. So that I think is going to be a good value proposition for this. Just like with the Esty, I will really like being able to use the longer Esterbrook nib in here. Now, you can tell that this is a longer nib in the regular, the old Esterbrook J, and so I'm sure there's enough cap room in there for it, but it'll make it even closer than this one. So, yeah, I'm looking forward to that. Now, I'm sure they wanted that to come out with the pen. I'm also sure that it was COVID-19 related stuff that backed up that manufacturing and design. So they say it's coming. I'm guessing in the next month or two is my guess, but I don't have any official word on that. So, looking at this section, and I'll have all the measurements and that sort of thing later on after the video, but you can tell that there is a very nice hourglassy shape to this. You can see it there in the chatoyance a bit. Inside that groove, you got about a 9mm section, and outside of it about a 10, so about a 1mm difference. So it depends on where you hold it. I tend to hold it like this, it turns out. So I have 2 fingers sort of down here in this groove, and the third up here on the threads. The threads are very small, as you can see there, and they're not sharp at all. They feel just fine on my fingers. I don't mind that at all. In fact, it gives it a little bit of extra grip so I can move it around better. You can use this pen unposted. I don't know. I waffle on it. I think it's fine to use it posted. It doesn't really overbalance it too much. Now, if you're a person that writes further back on a pen, that's even better because then it puts the weight right here, and that's very comfortable to have all that weight right in the webbing instead of back here trying to pull the pen backwards. So that works out pretty well, I think. I do sort of, I'm picking nits, I do kind of wish that this this cap band had moved back a bit. I'm not sure why it's here instead of back here. I think they could have done that. And who knows? Maybe if they decide to do a blind cap thing like I was suggesting, then maybe they would. But I don't know, man. It looks fine. It doesn't really bother me. That's just a nit that I would pick if I were picking nits. Inside this pen is a set of metal threads. There's also, you can probably see down there inside, you can actually get a little bit of a glint off the finial down there. So yeah, you're not going to eyedropper this pen with this configuration with that piece of metal down there and the metal threads. It just wouldn't go great, so don't do that. Oh, look at that, I'm almost out of ink. It's right here. So yeah, I've actually filled this a couple of times with different inks because I wanted to see what this ink would do. And it's really nice in here. You get an Esterbrook branded converter. It's doing well. This ink is Birmingham Pen Company Electron, which I'll do a review coming up soon. Okay, so that's those are the features and the look of this thing. Let's put it next to a bunch of other pens and see how that looks. All right, so this is the Esterbrook JR next to some other stuff. You have the venerable Esterbrook J, the JR, the Sailor Pro Gear Slim. This is a Franklin-Christoph Model 46. Let's put a more colorful one in there. Franklin-Christoph Model 46. Then you have the Platinum 3776, and then you have a Pilot Custom 92, which is the flat end version of the Custom Heritage 74. So, or is this custom? This is a Custom Heritage. So, anyway, I really like this pen. It's good size and stuff. And you can see that the J and the JR are both on the smaller version. They're pretty much on the smaller end of the spectrum. They're pretty much the same size as the Sailor Pro Gear Slim, which is a perfectly fine size. I actually had these in my my pocket pens video as a slightly bigger than a pocket pen situation because they're bigger than a pocket pen, but not a whole lot bigger, I think. And I'm comfortable throwing this in my pocket. I'm not sure about this one. I'm always a little bit more wary of my vintage pens. Okay, so the reason I put these all together is because they have kind of the same price point, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit. Let's take off some caps and get some relative links uncapped. Okay, so here we go with some relative uncapped lengths. We have again, the J, the JR, the Pro Gear Pro Gear Slim, the Franklin-Christoph 46, the Platinum 3776, and the Custom Heritage 92. And once you've uncapped these, there's not a huge difference between the lengths. These two, of course, are the same size. That was on purpose. The Pro Gear ends up a little bit shorter. And actually, the 3776 is pretty darn close. It's just a smidge longer. So if you like those, then you'll like these just fine, I think, even though it has a smaller nib on it. And then the custom heritage over here, but this one is definitely the biggest. Okay, so we were talking about price and some differences and that sort of thing there, so we might as well just go ahead and talk about that a bit now, because most of the chatter I've seen online about this pen has been like, it's pretty expensive, and I don't know why I wouldn't just get a J, and I could get so many other things. Well, it's true that the price point this pen falls into is kind of crowded. The manufacturer's suggested retail price on the JR is $175, and that gives it a street price of $140 after the typical sort of vendor discounts. And that's what you'll find it for at Pen Boutique and pretty much everywhere else, I think. And so that puts it in line with like this one and this one, a little bit underneath these two, but still in the same kind of ballpark, right? So this one is between the 3776s. The price is very wildly. You can get these from like $100 to like a couple $100, but in the same kind of ballpark. And then the same with the Pilot. So at least this one is usually these Pro Gear Slims are around the 150-ish mark, so pretty close. So you might be asking yourself, like, why would I get one of the new pens when I could just get one of the old ones and save some money? Because the venerable Esterbrook J is like, the price is very wildly. I've gotten one as low as like $25. I've also seen them in the hundreds. So this is a vintage pen, and that means that the price of it is going to be dependent upon things like, has it been restored? How rare is the color and that particular form of the pen? Because there's a lot of different ones like this. What kind of nib does it have in it? Because these are all individually numbered nibs. Well, not individually, but they're all numbered nibs. This is a 2668, which is one of those fine nibs. And it's actually a very nice fine nib. But those things affect the price. And so like, you can get one of these in some cases like $100 cheaper than you can find one of the new JRs. So there are a bunch of differences between these two, and so let's talk about them a little bit. First is filling systems. This is a cartridge or converter pen. This is a lever fill, so you have this little lever on the side, and it's got a spring inside which compresses a sack, like a rubber sack that holds the ink, and that's how you get ink in and out of this pen and where it's stored and all that sort of thing. So one thing I'll say about the JR is that maintenance on this guy is easier than maintenance on one of these. It's easier to flush, it's easier to fill, it's easier to repair if something goes wrong. Like if the converter breaks, you just get a new converter. It costs you like $7. If the sack goes bad in this, and oftentimes if you find it on like eBay or like lots of places, you'll like shake it and you'll hear a rattle. That's because the sack is corroded and turned into like little plastic or rubber shards. And then you have to open this up, or really you're probably going to send it to somebody else, and they're going to have to open this up with some heat and take this apart carefully and then replace the sack and make sure that nothing is rusted inside here, because if you get water inside here, it can rust the whole like spring assembly and all that jazz, and that's a pain. So like, there are a few things with vintage pens that are not ideal and are just kind of harder to deal with. None of those problems with the JR. Secondly, this is it's a very different feeling between this one and the JR. And just being perfectly honest, I'm always a little bit nervous to use old Esterbrook's. Now I know they're tough. I know they've taken a beating because they've been around forever. And yet, I always feel like I have to be a little more careful with them than I would with a modern pen. Even if it costs more and I could buy two of these, say, for the price of this one, I'm still going to be a little bit more careful with the older pen. I don't know if it's just respect for the age or if it's something like it just feels smaller in my hand. I don't know what the deal is, and I think it's my deal and not something you have to worry about, but maybe you feel that way about those too. And thirdly, there's just a style difference. Like, these are different looking pens. Do I wish they'd been able to like really reproduce the J in a modern form that had a lot more J characteristics? I think that would have been cool, but this is a very different pen. And so to some extent, comparing the J to the JR is not exactly fair because they're different things, you know? So if you like the J, get yourself some J's. These are great pens. They come with cool nibs and some interesting features. If you like the look of the JR, $140 is not outlandish for this sort of pen, right? Gold trim, turned acrylic, Yovo nib, and I gotta say, this Yovo nib wrote really, really well, and that's what I expect. I know Yovo nibs and I like them. And there are a lot of nib choices for these as well. I mean, you can get them extra fine up to 1.1 stub, and then if you can get the new like converter section thing, then you can get all the old nibs too. So you can bring some of that vintage beauty back, or beauty, I don't know, vintage cool back to this this like modern pen. So I think they're different pens, and I think in some sense there's a disservice being done to it when you compare the prices of the two things, because they're just very different things, right? Okay, let's do a little writing sample and then get out of here. Okay, so this, I'll go ahead and post it for this writing sample, because why not? This is the Esterbrook. Let me do this E again. I have been waving this pen around with the cap off for a while. Esterbrook JR, says a Yovo. Fine nib. And it's inked with Birmingham. Pen & Co. Electron. And actually, it's looking really good on this paper. What the heck am I using here? This is just a little Kyakudo memo notebook, which I thought was kind of cool. I forget where I even picked this up. I don't even know. It might have been Van Ness. I have no idea actually. And this paper seems to have handled it pretty well. This ink is a little bit on the bleedy side, but this paper is also not like super fountain pen friendly. So this is actually pretty good. In fact, I put this ink in a lot of pens. We'll talk about that later. We'll talk about that in the ink review. But look out for the ink review for this ink, because it's pretty cool. Now, as far as flow, I haven't had any problems writing quickly. It'll scribble just fine. It doesn't seem to have much of a sweet spot, if any. I mean, it's a fine nib. It's looking actually pretty medium on this paper, but I think that's a matter of the paper like letting the ink spread a little bit and the ink wanting to spread a little bit. So you have that. But yeah, no problems writing with this nib. It's been great, and all the inks I've tried in it, which are 2 or 3. So there you go. Yeah, writes perfectly well, man. Look at it. Writes great. No problem. Okay, so this has been the Esterbrook JR. I hope you've enjoyed this review and learned a thing or two, and stick around for all the stats and the like lengths and all that sort of jazz. And thank you again to Carrie at Kenro and Lena at Pen Boutique for loaning this out for review. And I will see y'all in another video. Like, comment, subscribe, tell a friend, and vote, pet a dog, spay and neuter your pets. I'll see y'all later. Peace out.